Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tina Sachs. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare here at Berkeley and also the faculty director of the Center for Research on Social Change. We are so excited to have Professor Jamila Michener here today. Her talk is entitled The Uncivil Polity, Race, Poverty, and Civil Legal Justice. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for Governmental Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Berkeley Institute for the Future of Young Americans. So before we begin, I want to announce our next event, which is on Tuesday, April 2nd. We are hosting a talk entitled Cultural Capital, Systemic Exclusion and Bias in the Lives of Middle-Class Black Women. This is an event that's a conversation between me about my book, Invisible Visits, and my colleague, Don Dow, who is a sociologist, and so we're going to be talking about our book, bringing our works in conversation with each other. The talk will take place from 4 to 5:30 in the Toll Room in Alumni House on the Berkeley campus, and the flyers are out in the lobby. So before we get started, I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones. And the format of today's event is Professor Michener will speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have Q&A. So it is really my pleasure, my deep honor actually, to introduce our speaker, Jamila Michener, who is an assistant professor of government at Cornell University. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and there is where our paths crossed. From 2011 to 2013, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholar in Health Policy Research at the University of Michigan. Michener's research has been supported by the Institute for Research on Poverty, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and RWJ and the Ford Foundation. She also is a public scholar. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vox, Salon, and many other outlets. She is also the author of the book Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jamila Michener.
All right, thank you all for being here. I don't know how, I'm coming from Ithaca, it was snowing when I left, so I don't know how any of you concentrate or how you're sitting in this room right now instead of being out there, basking in the sunshine and the warm weather. But thank you nonetheless for finding a way to concentrate and come and join me here today. I'm actually going to be presenting about some work that is a new project that I'm working on. That's going to be my second book project that I'm actually co-authoring with a colleague, Mallory Sorrell, who's an assistant professor at Lafayette College. And so I'm excited to present this because I will say, as Tina said, I recently published a book, and so I've been doing a lot of book talks, and I'm at the point now where I'm like, okay, I'm ready to start talking about work that hasn't already been published and that I can't change. And to start talking about the ideas that I'm pursuing now in kind of the next stage of my research. Nonetheless, I have an obligatory book slide so that you can see the book. I did write a book, you should buy it, and then you shouldn't just buy it and keep it on your shelf, you should read it. And thanks for bearing with me. But one of the things that this book reflects, and that anything that I ever work on will reflect, is sort of my core interest. And my core interest, the reason why I went to graduate school, the reason why, as I understand myself, why I'm doing my work, is because I care about understanding the lives of people who live on the economic and racial margins of American society. And in particular, as a political scientist, I care about understanding the way that the government, the state, and politics intersect with the lives of those people and sort of shape their lives. And in particular, I care a lot about democratic citizenship among those folks at the margins, right? So in my book, I explored that through the lens of Medicaid. And in the project that I'm working on now, that I'm going to talk about today, I explore it through the lens of civil law, right? So normally, when I introduce these ideas to people, they think that I'm talking about like criminal justice, because that's on our radar, right? That's something that, in particular among political scientists and sociologists, there's been a lot of attention to in the last 10 to 15, although longer than that, years. But in particular, the last decade or two, We've seen much more attention to mass incarceration and the carceral state, and that's important. It's an important emphasis that I'm glad is there. But one of the things that's really struck me as I've thought about this is that I've thought a lot about the civil side of the law, right? And now it may not be clear to everybody what that really consists of. It certainly wouldn't have been clear to me except for a rather idiosyncratic experience, right? Which is that when I was in college, I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. But I also have essentially for my entire life, for the early part of my life, because it was a function of my existence, and then when I got to college because of that experience, I've always been preoccupied with poverty, right? Poverty and inequality. And when I got to college, I thought I took a lot of classes on poverty and sociology department, anthropology department, any department that I could take a class in to understand it. So I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, but I also knew I cared a lot about poverty. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll be like a public interest lawyer, I'll do poverty law. And so I grew up in Queens, New York, and one summer I just sent, this was before you emailed everyone, right? Because I guess I'm getting old. I sent letters, actual letters, with my resume in them to sort of every legal services organization that I could find in the tri-state area to try to find an internship one summer. And as fate would have it, Queens Legal Services, right in the neighborhood not far from where I grew up, responded to me. The executive director reached out to me and said, you know what, we'll have you do an internship. We don't normally have interns here, but you sound like you're interested, you're local. We'll even pay you a stipend. It was like a dream come true. I was like, yes, this must be a sign I'm fated to be a lawyer. And I'm going to do poverty law, and I'm going to represent low-income people. It was a really long summer. It was a hard experience. It was very depressing. I came out of the other end like in awe of the attorneys. They were doing, what seemed to me to be God's work, and not being compensated nearly the way that they could have been if they just did something else with their law degrees. But part of the role, so the executive director said, I'm not just going to make you push paper. I want you to get a sense of what this is about. So he would let me go to court with the attorneys and shadow them. And one of the major things that my responsibility was intake, right? So someone would come into Queens Legal Services with some sort of they focused on civil issues, right? So it wasn't someone who had been accused of committing a crime and who just had a right to an attorney by function of that accusation. These were folks who had problems with housing, right? Maybe they were being evicted or their homes were being foreclosed on. There was some sort of a repossession issue, forfeiture, or some sort of challenge with fraud or debt. Their public benefits might be being taken away for reasons that were not clear to them or that they understood to be unfair or unjustified. Domestic violence. If you're in a relationship and you want an order of protection, that's actually a civil matter, and you have to go to a civil court in order to get an order of protection, right? Custody issues, right? All of these things are civil. And immigration, detention and deportation, most of those cases actually don't involve a crime because coming into the country illegally is not actually a crime. It's not a criminal offense. So people were coming into Queens Legal Services with all of these issues. So the biggest issues that summer that I can remember, a lot of evictions, a lot of people losing public benefits, and a lot of child custody issues. And these folks, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly people of color, would come into the office, and the intake officer, which is what I was doing for the summer, had to listen to what they understood their legal problems to be. There were forms that I had to fill out as they were talking to kind of suss out like what exactly was going on. And then I would give all of that information to the attorneys, and the attorneys would decide whether or not they were going to take the person's case. And often the decision it wasn't about the merit of the case per se, it wasn't about how compelling the case was. They were only going to be able to represent at best half of the people who came through the door because of resources, limited resources. And so they went for the cases that they thought were winnable, and they went for the cases that they thought were straightforward. A lot of people had very complicated cases, right, that involved 2 or 3 of these things, right? You were in a domestic violence situation, and that caused your landlord to evict you. And now, because you don't have an address that you can put on your public benefits application, you've lost your benefits. Well, that's multiple cases. And the attorneys approach those kinds of cases very cautiously because they could just end up being time and resource sucks, and they didn't have time and resources. It was depressing to sit there day after day and listen to all of these folks who were literally from my neighborhood, living very similarly to the way that I grew up. And then to watch them either be able to get help or be turned away. And even when they got help, often the help was limited, right? So, it turns out you're being evicted, but you live in an illegal basement that you shouldn't have been living in the first place, and we can use that to our legal advantage and make your landlord either continue to allow you to live there or give you an extra 120 days before you have to get out. Those were the kinds of... Now, for people experiencing eviction, that's huge. It's really important. But I was sort of deeply dissatisfied with that. And I had all of these questions about why the system was set up the way it was set up. And so I went back to, after the summer was over, I went back to school and I thought about what I wanted to do. I didn't have an epiphany like, I know, I'll go to grad school and I'll figure it all out. But I did know that I didn't want to do this. So it was at least process of elimination. But from that point, I had always sort of had an interest in and a kind of preoccupation with the civil law, and in particular with understanding the way that civil law and civil legal claims intersected with some of the other things I was interested around race, class, and gender inequality. Now, in grad school, I sort of thought about all these things, and I think I casually mentioned it to some of my advisors, who, I think very rightly told me, that's a little too much for you at this stage. You really shouldn't do this, right? In part because this isn't a realm that political scientists have really waded into previously, and it's kind of challenging as a grad student to do something that, no one else in your field has done, right? And to do it well, especially when it's big. It's still too big, and so we can talk about that. But just to give you a sense of how these things fit together, right? So 71% of low-income Americans report having civil legal problems in the last year, right? A quarter of them actually report having 6 or more civil legal problems. So of the sort that's on the slide that I showed you before this. 72% of people who actually receive legal aid, right? 72% of those beneficiaries are women. 52% are people of color, and here's the specific breakdown. So this is an arena where sort of race, gender, and class are intersecting in a particularly acute way, right? And it's an arena, I would say, given those acute intersections, we actually think very little about, right? When we think about justice systems and race, class, and gender, the first thing we think is mass incarceration and criminal justice and the kind of over-incarceration of black and brown men and the implications of that, whether it's sociologically or politically or what have you. And we should absolutely be thinking about those things. But there's this whole other side of the law, the civil side, that matters for how people who don't have anything to do with the criminal law experience their day-to-day life, right? And whether they are able to maintain economic and social stability. And a lot of those issues are adjudicated in the civil arena, and we just don't know much about the politics of that. And I'm a political scientist, so this is what I care about, the politics of it. There's also inequality with respect to access to representation. So 86% of civil legal problems just don't really get any attention. There are roughly 60 million Americans who are eligible for legal services as per 2016, and very few of them are actually receiving those services, right? And many, many people, even people who understand that they have a legal problem, who seek out legal assistance, half of them are getting turned away for reasons that don't have anything to do with the merit of their cases, but just because of insufficient capacity, right? There's fewer than one civil legal aid attorney to help every 10,000 Americans living in poverty. And so, you're going to have some problems if you think about 10,000 Americans living in poverty, but there's not going to be the legal aid infrastructure to actually be able to help those people. So what I am primarily interested in as a political scientist is what the implications of civil legal institutions are for democratic citizenship, right? How do these institutions shape democratic citizenship? Now, when I think about, I'll tell you in a second what I'm talking about when I say civil legal institutions, because that's sort of how I'm going to structure the rest of the talk. And I think about democratic citizenship pretty capaciously, right? So I'm thinking about, in a kind of traditional way that political scientists do, political citizenship, the extent to which people engage in the political system or process, the extent to which they vote, the way that they understand themselves to be a part of the political system, their willingness to, their attitudes about government and politics. But I also think about the social dimension of citizenship, right? What about your basic access to basic material needs, right? are you going to be able to have a roof over your head? Are you going to be able to receive your public benefits? And social and political citizenship are linked, right? Your ability to sort of have your material needs met is connected to what sort of role you're going to play in the larger polity. And so I'm interested in understanding both of these things, and in particular, I'm interested in their interconnections. I was trying to figure out, like, well, what have political scientists done on this already? And nothing's ever really your idea. You learn this as a scholar. You're never really the first person to have thought about anything. At least in my experience, I'm never really the first person to have thought about anything. And I was talking to a colleague of mine a few months ago, Joe Sauce, and he said, oh, there was this article in the APSR, which is like the top political science journal, in like 1983 that was about this. And I was like, are you serious right now? First of all, who remembers the APSR from 1983? Apparently there are some people who do. I, however, was 2 in 1983, so I don't feel too terribly bad that I was not familiar with that article. And I found it and read it, and it actually was not a political scientist who wrote the article. It was a legal scholar and legal practitioner who just managed to publish in the APSR, which I don't think would really happen today, but what do I know? And Francis Kahn-Siemens. And, Kahn-Siemens makes this interesting argument that the courts, in particular civil courts, are like fundamentally about democracy, right? It says if the dispersion of power provides protection from tyranny, then the potential for every individual to mobilize the law can play an important role in democratic governance. And the kind of logic of the piece is that the thing about the civil law is that it's you mobilizing the law on your behalf, right? So either because you have a landlord that's trying to evict you, and that eviction is not fair, it's not legal, and so you go to court, you mobilize the law, and you stop that from happening, right? You have a debtor, and the terms of your contract are in some way unfair to you, or unfair to them. One or the other party mobilizes the law, and you use the law in order to try to adjudicate your way to a fair outcome, and et cetera, right? In these various realms of everyday life, ordinary people can mobilize the civil law in order to try to shape the trajectory and the outcomes of their lives, right? And anybody can do it, right? And so in this kind of, I think, overly optimistic way, Kahn-Siemens says, this isn't necessarily egalitarian, but if we could find a way to make it so, it could be a really important feature of democratic life, right? And then that sort of gets dropped. I looked at the folks who sort of pick this up and cite this piece, and people cite it and go in other directions, and there's very little work that really thinks about, well, where does civil law and civil legal institutions stand as a kind of component of a democratic polity, right? So this is what I'm trying to understand. The broader project is actually bigger than what I'm going to present to you today, and it's too big. It's going to be a book, and so I can't present everything. And we still have some narrowing to do. So in the broader project, we're going to take sort of a micro, meso, and macro focus, which is how I tend to do things. And so on the micro level, we've been compiling this database of state and federal policies that have anything to do with civil legal services or representation. And we want to understand how political institutions structure over time, right? Our federal policy database starts in 1950. Our state policy database is a little bit more constrained because of our data sources, but it starts in 1920. So the kind of time, the structure, the longitudinal structure of the data is different depending on the level that we're looking at. But we want to understand, at least for over a significant period of time, what role has policy been playing and how has it shaped access to civil legal institutions. So that's our more sort of bird's eye view. And we're also thinking about, my colleague who's working on this with me, Mallory Sorrell, really looks at American political development. She thinks about these things from a historical perspective. And so she's thinking about the kind of historical development of civil legal services and the points at which that's intersected with democratic citizenship over time. The part that I'm going to talk to you about today, and the part that's sort of most in my forte, is really thinking about this on a micro level from the perspective of people's experiences with civil legal institutions, right? And so the question that I'm asking is what are the experiences that people have with these institutions, and how do those experiences affect them? This is way too broad of a question right now, but you're broad when you're at the kind of early stages of a book project, right? That's actually the civil court in Queens, New York, where I grew up, not far from where I grew up, and where I spent a lot of time that summer when I was working with Queens Legal Services. So to begin, we're actually going to have a multi-method approach over the sort of long haul of this project. But to begin, we're starting with a qualitative approach, in part because when you're embarking on a new research project where there's not a sort of significant literature already established, what is something quantitative going to look like in the context of me having very little knowledge about what is even happening with respect to people's experiences of these institutions, right? What questions would I put on a survey? I don't know, right? I could make something up out of thin air. I'm sure I would then find something and I would be able to say it was a finding. But starting with people's experiences and starting qualitatively allows me to be able to, at later stages in the project, make sure that the other kind of methodological approaches I take are grounded in something real, right? In knowledge of the processes that I'm interested in understanding. So we're beginning with in-depth interviews with key actors across the country. So different sorts of people we're interviewing. Ordinary people who have civil legal problems, and we're finding these people in a variety of ways. I've just been hanging out at civil courts, and it's amazing to me how willing and ready people are to talk about what's going on, because they're, for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into in a second, but often there are really crucial things in their lives on the line. They're confused. You walk into this courthouse, nobody talks to you. You hardly know what's going on. I hardly know what's going on. And so when there's somebody there who wants to have a conversation with you about what's happening, people are willing. We are also using civil, legal aid organizations as places to recruit. And then non-legal aid organizations that are community organizations that work with low-income people, the sorts of people who are most likely to face civil legal problems. So we're recruiting people in a variety of different ways so that we can get folks who have civil legal problems, but maybe just, and who are going to court and who are kind of struggling with these issues in a variety of ways, but may not have legal representation, right? And then we want people who actually have civil legal representation, right? We want beneficiaries of legal representation. And they're going to be different experiences depending on whether you have representation or whether you don't. We're going to be able to talk to both of those folks. We're interested in people who apply for legal representation and get rejected. So some people have legal problems and they never even think to even look for representation. So those are some of the people we're interviewing. But some people do think to look for representation but don't get it. So there are some key contrasts between these groups of people that are going to help us going to give us a little bit of empirical leverage and help us get a range of experiences when we interview people. And then we're also going to interview attorneys and advocates and activists. So we've started doing some of these interviews. We're really only at the beginning stages. I've interviewed 22 people thus far. People always say, well, how many people will you interview? And then I don't know. The way that I do qualitative work isn't to sort of pick a number of, randomly, arbitrarily pick a number of people that I'm going to interview at the beginning, and then once I get through that number, stop. It really depends on what we're finding, and often the goal is saturation. So when we get through enough people who have this range of experiences, and we're no longer hearing anything, we'll stop. My guess is that it will be a lot. My guess is that we'll do well over 100 interviews because there are such a wide range of experiences. And even in the first 22 interviews, the variety of things that interviewees are telling us is wide. So that makes me think it's going to be a while, which is fine. And this is why I have a co-author in this project. We can split the work. We're going to, in order to try to make this a little bit less unwieldy, we're going to focus on 3 civil legal domains. So that slide I showed you at the beginning, that's not even exhaustive of all the things that count as civil legal problems or issues. We can't study everything. It's just too much. So we're going to focus on 3 domains that have key variation in race, class, and gender, like the axes of inequality that we care most about. And so we're going to look at housing, debt, foreclosure, and immigration. Those are the 3 kinds of legal problems we'll focus on. The courts and the people who face those legal problems really vary along the lines of race, right? There's some class variation as well, especially with debt and foreclosure courts being slightly more middle class, more white, and more male, right? And so we're going to look at these, we're going to focus on these 3 areas. Any 3 areas that we would have picked. So some people have said, well, why don't you pick 3 areas such that in 2 of them, almost everything is the same, or only vary one factor in each, do this thing so you try to triangulate into the one thing. You can't really do that with civil legal domains, right? these things are going to vary in ways that aren't perfect for from a research design perspective, no matter what domain that we pick, right? And so we just have to make some choices. And we want the choices to be well thought out. We want them to be rooted in our core theoretical concerns. But there's no like research design approach that's going to allow us to pick the domains that are going to give us like optimal variation, right? But these are the domains that we pick for a variety of reasons because of what it is that we care about. So I said earlier, I'm interested in understanding the relationship between civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship, right? So what do I mean when I say civil legal institutions? That wouldn't be immediately clear to me if I weren't the one who was working on this project. We really are letting people tell us this, right? As we talk to people in interviews, this is what's coming up the most for people. This is what's defining their relationships to kind of the civil law, right? One is, and most obviously, I think, courts. You know, people figure out that they have a civil legal problem because they get a document that says, you got to show up in court. Your landlord's taking you to court. Often that's the way it happens. Sometimes not. Sometimes you need an order of protection because your life is being threatened. And so you find your way to a lawyer or to a court to try to mobilize the law on your behalf. But often people are sort of dragged into the civil legal system because they get a document. You're losing your public benefits. If you don't want it to happen, show up at this administrative court. You're going to be evicted. If you don't want it to happen, show up at this court. And so courts are like a key part of the kind of first line, or the first place that people experience civil legal institutions in any significant way, right? Legal aid organizations are important too. Not everybody goes to legal aid organizations. A lot of people, in fact, just show up in court. They just wander into court. They have no idea that they need representation. But often, eventually, people figure out they really can't do this alone. It's a lot more complicated than they thought it would be. And they start to try to find help. And often, the kind of next kind of line for folks is trying to engage civil legal organizations. A lot of these people are going to get turned away. And some of them are not. Whether they get turned away or not, those experiences are shaping the way that they think about the structure of the civil legal system and the way that they understand who they understand themselves to be in relation to the system. And then this is what I didn't expect, but really has come out through some of the interviews that I've had thus far. Community organizations seem to play a large role as intermediary organizations that either help to link people to legal aid organizations, sometimes help people to navigate courts in really informal ways. There are these organizations, for example, in New York City where I've been doing some interviews. And what they do is they're not lawyers. They don't have the resources of the kind of formal official resources of legal aid organizations. They're just people who live in a particular community who went through extended legal battles and who know how difficult the courts are to navigate. They mobilize and they show up in courts. You know, sometimes there are tenant associations that say a lot of people are getting evicted. We're going to ask some lawyers to give us a training about how to avoid eviction, and then our tenant association is going to rotate showing up in court and trying to help people, give them advice, give them feedback. But community organizations are actually doing a lot of work in this field, and they're sort of directly engaging often other civil legal institutions. So they're part of the civil legal institutional infrastructure. So these are the three kind of institutional nodes that I'll focus on. They're not exhaustive, and we may find that there are other key institutional nodes as we go along. But these are the nodes that are kind of coming to the fore most thus far. And what we're finding is real variation across these nodes in terms of people's experiences. So there's no one story about how civil legal what kinds of experiences people have with civil legal institutions. It really depends on the institution. And on the kind of specific kind of node or point in the institution that they're at, right? And so civil legal processes we're finding can be sort of politically mobilizing or demobilizing. It depends on the nature of the particular process. And I'll give you some detail about that in a second. So outcomes really vary. And sometimes the thing that we're finding both interesting and challenging to sort of wrap our minds around is that the different kind of pieces of this institutional infrastructure are often working at cross purposes, right? So that if you ask people to tell you about their experiences in the courtroom, they're saying one set of things, but then if you ask them to tell you about their experiences with their representation through a lawyer, a legal aid lawyer, they're saying completely different things. And then if they have some sort of intermediary organization, like a community organization that's been involved in helping them navigate all of that, that completely changes the way that they understand who they are, what they're up to. And so there's no single story, and there's interaction across these institutional nodes, which means it's going to be complicated, but that's okay. I knew that getting into this. So I'll just give you, I don't want to talk for too long, right? So I'm going to be mindful here. And I'm just going to sort of talk you through a handful of the interviews that I've talked to, or that I've done, and the kind of experiences that people have had at these different institutional points, right? To try to help you understand some of what we're finding and seeing, and give you a sense of some of the insights that we're drawing out thus far. The names are all fake, right? Except they start with the same letter. So this woman's name really does start with the C, but it's not Candida. Candida is actually my best friend growing up. So she tells me, I met her through a local community organization in New York City, and for the sort of first part of this project, often we start from a place of like finding the people who are most politically apathetic and then trying to figure out, why are you apathetic? So one of the things that I did at the beginning of these interviews is I started at a different point. I wanted to find people who were really engaged, who were like connected to organizations, but who also had like really intense civil legal problems, and try to understand like, you know, how is it that people are having really challenging civil legal problems, but still a part, an engaged part of the process. Now, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to look at the other end too as I go along, and then contrast. But I started with people who had organizational linkages, both because they're easy to find, they're easier to get to, and because I think that's an important sort of axis of variation that I'm interested in. I want variation in the outcome of interest. I don't just want everybody to be demobilized or apathetic, right? And Candida, she's a lot of people described her. I didn't get to her initially. I interviewed other people, and she kept coming up. Oh, there's this person in our neighborhood. She's really at the forefront of all this. She's the person I go to when I need help. So I tracked her down. I said, okay, talk to me. And she tells me about, you know, a challenge that she had several years ago with her landlord. She was paying her landlord rent, and her landlord wasn't cashing the checks. The checks would just not go anywhere. And she had the copies of the checks. She was giving the landlord the checks. The landlord wasn't cashing them. And after 4 months of not cashing checks, the landlord starts sending her eviction notices and says, you're not paying your rent. I want you out. Candida lived in a rent-stabilized apartment. And, I mean, the landlord's gambit was essentially to get her gone so that he could renovate the apartment and then be in sort of a legal position to now rent the apartment at a market rate and make a lot more money than he was making from Candida, who's a low-income woman of color and who could only pay her rent-stabilized rate, right? And so she ends up in court trying to fight this. And initially she's confused. Like, she goes to court, she doesn't know anybody. People's names are getting called out. She doesn't know what's going on. No one tells her what she has to do. And she talks about it as the beginning of sort of getting wrapped up in the Bronx housing court nightmare, right? But she learns, right? In part, she learns because there was a judge. She shows up in front of this judge, and the judge is like, what are you doing? You need an attorney. Like, you're not going to be able to do this alone. One of the things she tells me is like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I did everything right. I had the rent, the evidence that I'd been paying the rent. Like, I was on top of things. There's no way if you're doing everything right. You should just be able to show up as an ordinary person in court and get justice. And the judge essentially is like, yeah, no, that's not the way that works. Like, you need to get representation. She says, oh, I didn't know. So that was the beginning of a long road of learning how housing court works, what was available and what wasn't available. And the long road for Candida eventually leads to her seeking help through a local community organization. She looked for help through legal aid, and she couldn't get it. She qualified economically, but they just didn't have the bandwidth to deal with this problem. It was a powerful renter in the community, a landlord in the community, and the legal aid organization that she went to already had several cases with this landlord, and they just weren't taking any more that involved that landlord until they worked through the batch that they already had. She couldn't get help from them. So she goes to a local community organization, and they're just doing like tenant training, like know your rights sort of thing. And she gets this training, she feels a little bit more empowered, and she decides to keep being a part of the organization. And there's this whole other story with her. She ends up being a community leader and doing things like staking out courthouses, looking for people to help and give advice to, and super engaged. But she starts out not knowing anything. So So her initial experiences with the courts, when I asked her just about that, what was that first, she ends up being in court over this case for 3 years. I asked her, what was that first couple months like, your first kind of exposure to this? And she talks about, she uses words like disoriented, confused, alienated, and that is how she thinks about the courts, right? So she had other experiences as she went along, but many people describe the courts this way. With legal assistance, people describe very differently. I'll walk you through Ryan really quickly because I won't read the slides because you can read. But so Ryan has a slumlord. His slumlord happens to be a police officer, and so there's a different way you're going to engage your landlord when they're a police officer, right? And you know that. He has a Section 8 voucher, and with Section 8 vouchers, Section 8 will show up and inspect the apartment sometimes. Section 8 did that, and Ryan's apartment actually had all of these code violations. So Section 8 says to his landlord, we're not going to pay you your portion. Section 8 pays a portion of the rent and Ryan pays another portion. Section 8 says we're not going to pay our portion. Like legally, we will not pay you our portion if the apartment is substandard. So you have to make the repairs and then we'll start paying you our portion again. Ryan never stops paying his portion, right? In part because the folks in Section 8 say, you don't stop paying because then he can have grounds to evict you. We'll stop paying and use that as leverage to get your apartment fixed. Well, instead of dealing with Section 8 and making the repairs, the landlord just decides he's going to evict Ryan. And so Ryan has emphysema. He goes to the hospital for a while. When he comes home, he gets served the eviction notice, right? This is the day after he comes home. He tells this story about the lawyer coming in. He could barely get out of bed. He has to get up out of his bed, go to the front door, and he gets served this eviction notice in front of his 5 kids, and it's just really traumatic experience for him. As at the point that I'm talking to Ryan, this has happened years ago. And as he's recalling the experience to me, he's in tears and talking about what it means to be standing in front of your 5 children and for you all to learn at the same time that you have to be gone. Even though he's still paying $1,400 a month in rent. That's his portion. But Section 8 isn't paying the rest, and he's getting evicted. And he doesn't understand one word on any of the documents. He says, he gave me the papers, I couldn't understand one word, one paragraph, one sentence of what I was reading, right? And he's at a loss of what to do. The next day, despite having just gotten back from the hospital because his lungs collapsed, he drags himself out of bed because he realizes I have to do something about this. But he doesn't know what to do. He goes to the corner store and he sees a friend of his, Vinny. And he tells Vinny what's going on. Vinny says, okay, go down to Webster. They have attorneys. And Ryan goes, and he eventually ends up explaining to them what his situation is. And even though, he wasn't next on the queue, he tells them about having 5 kids and needing a lawyer. He ends up getting a lawyer, right? And he actually says to me, this is like 2 hours into the interview, and he's like, to make a long story short. And I'm like, actually, that's not what has happened here. But I don't mind. This is the point, right? You want to establish rapport. You want to hear about people's experiences. After years, he winds up winning the case, right? He's in a brand new apartment today. And he talks about the effect this had on his children, that his daughter, when this first started, was an A and B student. Her grades dropped to D's and F's. And as they came out of this crisis, she starts doing well again. And now she's in college. She's studying to be a nurse. He tells me about all of the different facets of his life that were affected during this time that he was dealing with this legal problem, and says again and again, I would have died if it weren't for an attorney. So even though Ryan's experiences in court are really negative, the overwhelming narrative that he has is one of winning. It's a positive narrative. Like when I ask him to tell me about his experiences with civil legal institutions, I don't say it like that. I say it in regular people's words. But the overwhelming narrative, that the kind of sense, the orientation of his narrative is a positive one. And it's all because he received legal assistance. And he says, well, if it weren't for that, everything would have been totally different. But I don't know that outcome, right? He doesn't know what that counterfactual would have looked like. What he knows is that it wasn't totally different. It was good, right? And so that's another node in this process. And then there's community organizations, right? So Frank has this really interesting story, which I won't go that deeply into. But for Frank, because of a range of different issues, the city ended up ordering the gas company to shut off the gas to his building. And once they shut it off, they had to shut it off and do some repairs. They shut it off and they started the repairs and realized that they were going to have to do much more extensive repairs than they thought. And the city said, well, until you do those repairs, you can't turn the gas back on. And he, all in all, it ends up being 3 years that him and the other tenants in his building go without having any gas in the building, right? This is New York City. It's not warm. You need gas. You can't cook food. I mean, so he's talking about how difficult it is. There's no gas or heat to cook, and this is years. And the landlord demands that they still pay the same amount of rent. There's not going to be any change in what they're paying for rent. And there's really essentially no compensating for their loss here, right? And this catalyzes Frank. And he starts to organize a tenant association because he's like, well, we need to do something. We can't. But he doesn't know anything about organizing a tenant association. He just heard that there's this thing called a tenant association. We can organize it. It'll help us to mobilize more effectively. He doesn't know what to do. So eventually, he starts to organize, but he realizes he's clueless. He starts to ask around. He talks to some local, his local city council members who point him to a local organization. Say, you should go to them if you want to start a tenant association. They'll tell you what to do. And he goes. He finds a group where he lived, a group called CASA, and he starts to work with them. And they actually ended up train him to be a leader. And now he leads multiple tenant associations around the country. And this particular landlord that was giving them the issue with this, he ends up taking them to court, and him and a bunch of other tenant associations, and they win. And he has, again, this story that has a completely different trajectory than you would imagine. When I first sat down to talk to him, I thought, so this is a low income, he's on the older side, he's like 63 years old, he's an immigrant, and he describes himself, he self-describes, he says, I'm nobody and I have nothing, right? That's who I am. But I was paying my rent, and at the very least, I should have gas, right? And so he goes from having this problem, having this grievance, to being mobilized. So when I asked him toward the end of the interview, well, what do you think about like civil courts, and do you see them as, I asked him something like, how do you understand civil courts? And he said, I think they're places where we can have power, which was really interesting because a lot of the other people I interviewed were not saying that. They were thinking about courts as places that were disempowered. And he said, well, not because of the courts. The courts themselves aren't where the power comes from. The power comes from the way that the courts, the position that the courts put people in that forces us to have to look beyond our individual lives and mobilize. He says, before this happened, I was just in my world. I didn't have any reason to, like CASA, the organization he ends up working with, they were right up the street. He just never thought about them, and he would have never devoted his time in that way. But he gets mobilized, or he starts thinking about the prospect of being mobilized because of what's happening in his experience with the courts. By the time he goes looking for CASA, he'd already gone to 2 court dates, and both were massive failures. And he says, I got to figure something else out. I got to start a tenant association. And it leads him down this road, right? So just as a kind of like way to sort of wrap up how I understand what I'm finding thus far, there's no wrap up, there's no conclusions, because I'm like, a quarter of the way through a book project. So if I gave you conclusions right now, that would be bad. They would not be fully based. They would not be well grounded. But one of the things we're finding is really variation across these institutional nodes that people are experiencing. Courts themselves, they experience as alienating, confusing, demoralizing. But courts are also very powerful. This is where the decisions get made that essentially affect the material outcome that matters most to people. Then a kind of intermediary between courts and ordinary people are legal aid organizations. And everyone I talked to who was able to secure a lawyer talks about how empowering it was, how going to court before without their lawyer and then going after with their lawyer was completely different. They have a different level of knowledge. They're incorporated in the system in a different way because now they're not completely clueless about what's going on. And legal aid organizations, though, are limited, right? They're only able to do so much for their clients because of the level of demand, and they're only able to take on so many clients. And then community organizations are not just empowering in the narrow context of the court. They're actually empowering and more broadly. They actually mobilize people to do more outside of themselves than they otherwise would have. They're actually engaging people, but they're resource deprived. And as limited as legal aid organizations are, community organizations are even more limited. They have an even less extensive reach. And so there's this ladder where as you go down the ladder, you decrease in actual power to affect the material outcomes in people's lives, but you increase in terms of the role that you play in empowering people, right? And as you go up the ladder, you increase in actual power. The decisions that the courts make are the decisions that are going to matter for people. But you actually decrease in the role that these institutions are playing in empowering people. So this is a kind of set of relationships that we think is structuring a lot of people's experiences with civil legal institutions. So we're going to continue doing our interviews. Eventually we'll collect some survey data. We're going to connect what I told you, those different macro and micro narratives that we're working on. And then we're going to write a book. And then next time I come back, I'll have an obligatory book slide, but there'll be a different book on it. So thank you. Questions?
Yeah. So I apologize if I missed it. Are you conducting all of your interviews in and around New York?
You didn't miss it. I just forgot to say. I'm really glad you asked me. So we're actually conducting interviews all over the country. So we're starting in the Northeast because that's where me and my co-author are. And so that's what we can do during the semester. So I'm doing interviews right now. I've done some in New York City, Rochester, Buffalo, and Albany. So different parts of upstate New York. I'm going to be in April doing interviews in New Jersey and some more in New York City. And then in the summer, when we have sort of the time and the space to fan out, we'll be doing interviews all over the country. So we're choosing where to do interviews in a number of ways. One is we want geographic variation because civil legal infrastructure varies a ton across space, right? Both in terms of like urban, rural, right? So for example, in upstate New York, there's a 4.5-hour radius, and everyone who lives in that radius, there's one immigration court. And so if you're in Ithaca and you get detained by, Ithaca's where Cornell is, where I am, and you get detained by ICE, which has happened recently actually, you're going to an immigration court in Buffalo. And if you're in really anywhere within that, that radius, you're going to Buffalo.
I've made that trip.
Yeah, it's not that close, right? And so like upstate areas operate very differently, not like rural and suburban areas operate very differently than urban areas. So we want to take that variation into consideration. And then there's regional variation, right? So one of the things that we're using, so there are a couple different metrics. There are places where the civil legal infrastructure is much more dense, right? So New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Maryland, there's a really dense infrastructure there. The ratio of civil legal attorneys to people living in poverty is like it's still low, but like much better than most of the rest of the country. The Pacific Northwest is sort of like that too, right? So we're going to do some interviews in Washington State. So Washington State actually has like a really good ratio and their civil legal infrastructure is very well developed. So we're focusing on places that have very well-developed, dense civil legal infrastructure and then other places less so, and trying to go along that continuum so that we don't just understand one set of experiences in one kind of place, right? And then we also want variation in terms of just like class and racial context, and so that means that we have to be working across place. So in the end, our goal is to interview people in 15 different states and then within each state in urban and rural areas. So that's why I said it will be a while. But actually, we'll have a ton of that done by the end of this summer because essentially this is what me and my co-author will spend our summer doing. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
If you need help.
If that's a sincere offer, I may just take it.
It is.
We'll talk. There's a lot actually. There's a lot with respect to immigration courts. Actually, this area there's a ton of interesting things going on. And a lot of variation in terms of the difference between what's happening in, for example, like Oakland proper, and then some of the places right outside of it. So this is on our radar. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, my experience, where there was a legal clinic in my neighborhood, I had issues. Neighbors had issues. Very hard to get those attorneys to represent you. You have too much money. You're not the right category. We can't do that kind of case. So, my sense is that there's when you say legal aid, there's a mismatch for a large proportion of people who have trouble in their position of power and money in the world. Now, I don't know, but...
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the things that we like a lot about, for example, looking at people who are in like foreclosure and different debt challenges. So a lot of those people are more middle class, right? And so they're either sort of working class, approaching middle class, or middle class, depends on how you think about those categories. And it is very hard for them to qualify for legal aid, right? And so in an ironic way, if you're getting evicted from your home and you're very, very poor, you're more likely to be able to, you're still actually not terribly likely to be able to get an attorney because there's just a lack of resources. That puts a hard ceiling on how much legal aid can do. But you're more likely than somebody who is more middle class, right? And so we want to try to think through some of those class dynamics, and in particular, think through the way that those class dynamics structure how people respond to a lack of, for example, access to representation, and how that shapes the way they think about the government. So I've done just a handful of interviews with legal attorneys, and one of the things that's really interesting, one of the attorneys I interviewed said, a big part of what we do is turn people down. And it's really hard because people come in and they understand themselves to be in the middle of like a life crisis. Mm-hmm. And especially for civil things, people are coming in there thinking, I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't committed a crime. I pay my taxes. I give back. And a lot of people think a right to representation extends to the civil realm. It doesn't. If you steal a Snickers bar, you have a right to an attorney, even though at most you're going to get 30 or 60 days probation, right? But if your children are being taken away, if your home is being taken away, if your benefits that you rely on to live are being taken away, you don't have any right to anything. If you're being deported or your children are being deported, you do not have a right, they do not have a right to representation for the most part. Some localities sort of try to essentially create that right through policy, but there's no constitutional right. But people don't know that. So they go in there thinking, I have a need. I'm a hardworking contributor to society. I'm going to ask for help and I'm going to get it, and they don't. And the attorney was telling me that they get mad. Right. They get mad, but they don't get mad, he says, at the government. So they don't say, why isn't the government funding civil legal aid? What they get mad at is other people who they presume are taking up those resources instead of them. Mm-hmm. So he said often, so this was an attorney who was working in Alabama, and he said often, if it's a white person who comes into the office and they get turned away, they'll say, all those poor black people are getting all the legal services they want, but you won't help me, right? And for middle class people more generally, it creates this kind of resentment towards the poor who are understood to be getting those resources when they're not, right? For poor people who are also getting turned away, not as much, but also getting turned away, they don't externalize the problem and think it's about the government either. They think it's about them and their lack of of course I'm not going to get this, right? We don't get anything. So there are all these interesting dynamics, and so I'm interested in what are the kind of political lessons that people are taking, not just from their experiences with the courts, but this is why legal aid organizations are important to me. Also their experiences with these organizations. So the people that I talked about today, legal aid is empowering them in many ways, but legal aid can play a very different role if you don't actually end up getting the aid, right? So that's really important, especially if it's in your community. You see it all the time. You see the kinds of people who are walking in there, and one day you have to walk in there and they tell you no. But you have this narrative in your mind about all the people who you think they've been helping, who are often others, right? They're not you. They're not like you. They're poorer, or they're browner, or whatever. So there's a lot of opportunity there for civil legal aid organizations as local community institutions to be sort of fueling a kind of politics of resentment within those communities. That's a kind of larger set of issues that I'm really attuned to and interested in sorting out.
And a quick follow-up, it's not just whether you get it or not. The offices are carpeted, the doors are locked usually. So it's another voodoo-like court. What's the open sesame?
How do you even, get any access whatsoever? Yeah. That's great.
There is this Frank who actually did something else than complaining. He empowered himself and looked for resources available to him to push through what was happening.
That's a specific?
Huh?
Or I'm trying to figure out the question.
No, it's not a question.
Oh, it was an observation.
From the what you presented.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think so. For me, the one of the things I still have to figure out is what the kind of frequency of these different kinds of outcomes looks like, right? Because I can talk to a handful of people for whom legal aid is really empowering and who have these kind of positive, empowering stories. And I think that's an important range of set of experiences to understand. But how common they are relative to other sets of experiences. And what are for the folks who are able to kind of push and engage that way and get these institutions to operate in a way that functions well for them, what is it about those folks? Are there institutional elements there? Is it idiosyncratic? Is it about one individual person who, what is the kind of systematic understanding that we can draw from these experiences? I think that's part of one of the challenges to this project, but it's also part of what makes it really exciting. So, yeah, I see your hand up.
So thank you so much for this work. I think I can just imagine all the implications it will have in the end. And I also want to thank you for sharing your experiences in the beginning about interning. So I had a very similar experience with interning for legal aid and the public housing intake and decided not to go to law school. So I definitely relate.
Everyone who's thinking that law school is for them should have to intern at legal services for a summer.
That's right. But my question, and I don't want to move the dialogue to criminal justice too much, but I do wonder if there are intersections that you're seeing with the criminal justice system and the civil legal system, and then where is that coming up, or if it's domain specific.
I think that's great. So a lot of that is it's gendered, right? So one of the things that's been really standing out to me is interviewing women who have said, my only other experience in court is when my brother got arrested or when my uncle, right? So there's a way that they think about court systems, and it's through the criminal lens, and it's usually overwhelmingly negative, and it's a sort of it's a symbol of injustice, right? And so but there are different ways that matters for how they're then sort of narrating to me their experiences in the civil realm, which this has been a little bit surprising to me, I would just say. I guess I expected a kind of wholesale carryover so that then when you're walking into housing court, you're just expecting to experience that, right? And there's some of that. But what has been more surprising to me is that the expectations are actually really different for housing court or family court or what have you. And they've been saying things to me but I haven't been accused of a crime or haven't committed a crime. I'm just trying to live my life. So this should be a court that's operating completely differently. And so there's this expectation that criminal courts are about punishing people. Civil courts are about helping people. But when you walk into a civil court and you feel like you're getting treated like a criminal, which is how people have experienced have described their civil court experiences to me, it has an extra sting, right? Because you're not a criminal, right? And I mean, many of the people in criminal court are being, right? But just the way that the tropes that folks have in their minds about who's in criminal court and who's. And so it's really like the kind of the contrast of the criminal court and whatever experiences people have had in that realm, and often they're not proximate experiences, but they're secondary experiences through family members, are shaping the way that the lenses through which they filter their civil legal experiences. So it's something that I want to remain attuned to, because I think there are important intersections there, but they're not as straightforward as I thought. So at first I thought, when I thought about this project, I thought, well, the criminal courts are going to be where, essentially where black and brown men are being oppressed. And maybe civil courts are the mirror of that for black and brown women, right? And that may be true, but that's not in a straightforward way how people are narrating their experiences to me, because their expectations going into each court are actually very different. And that, the disjuncture between their expectations and reality is alienating them even more from a court that is supposed to be differently designed than criminal court and does serve different ends, right? So I think those intersections are really important.
Are there alternative structures like in other countries that might be resolving these issues?
That's interesting. I don't know. I haven't looked at this too extensively comparatively. I actually just a few days ago ordered all of these books on comparative court systems, because I realized, I'm not a lawyer, so even learning about the court system in the U.S. has been a steep learning curve for me. But, I'm problem driven, so I'm I care about this, and I think political scientists need to bring their lenses to it, so I'm going to do it. But so I haven't gotten to the kind of the other, outer circle of the kind of comparative case. But I do know that U.S. civil courts have a higher caseload and have many and are processing many more people than most other civil courts internationally, with just a handful of exceptions, right? In places like Brazil and South Africa that have like court systems that are very kind of directly geared toward providing like immediate compensation to the most poor people in the country. So, but those courts, and there's problems actually with some of those systems. But so I haven't thought about the comparative cases yet. But I think it's an important direction to go in for insights. Especially, I'm not quite at the point. I'm at the point now where I'm trying to understand how these systems work. But I think when I get to the point where I'm trying to get a handle on options and alternatives, right? And in particular policy alternatives, I think it's really important then to think about who's doing it better than us. Usually the answer is lots of folks, and we have things to learn, So, yeah.
Yeah, so three really brief questions. First of all, I can make assumptions, but I want to make sure I understand specifically what you meant by, I forgot how you worded it now.
Oh, is it on one of these slides that I can find for you?
But the democratic repercussions of how did you put it in the
democratic citizenship, or did I say?
No, I thought I remembered. I'm listening to everybody else's questions. Of the democratic repercussions of civil legal
institution, yeah.
What you specifically mean by that? Also, with regard to people blaming each other instead of, why does the government provide more resources? I guess I make an assumption because that's who they see, but I still wonder, even though that's who they see as taxpayers, why don't they wonder why the government isn't providing more resources? And three, I can maybe understand someone feeling positive in the overall sense that they come out and, they end up being some sort of community organizer, tenant organizer, whatever. But, I received an invalid parking ticket, and I was trying to find a nicer way to say it, but pissed off that I had to spend 2.5 hours going to the parking agency to get this thing dismissed, which it was. To me, unless you come out as an organizer, I'm thinking, why aren't people pissed off that they've been sucked into this system that's taken 3 years of their lives when they haven't done anything wrong, when they have paid their rent, etc.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's the modal response. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to sort of show you some variation and there are possibilities here, right? So civil legal institutions aren't and don't need to be inherently demobilizing or alienating or, causing people to be angry. So I think some of the examples I showed you, I sort of want to emphasize that. But I think the modal experience is exactly that, is that I've just wasted, whether it's 2 hours or 2 years, a lot of time of my life when I didn't do anything wrong, right? And often, when people so there are some people I get to, at the end, they say, yeah, I won my case. But there's no real, it's a Pyrrhic victory. You won your case, but you lost years of your life. And, some people will say, one woman said to me, the last 2 years of this case, I've aged by a decade in 2 years, right? It's literally taken away years of my life. So there's no, winning then, right? So I think that's right. So when I say democratic repercussions are democratic outcomes, I really do mean that broadly. So some political scientists would mean it more narrowly, and they mean something like voting or registering to vote or, maybe participating in a political campaign. All of those things are fine, right? So, Frank, who says, I went to my legislator and I said, well, who can I talk to about this? Well, that's contacting your local political official. That's a form of political engagement that's spurred by his kind of experiences with the system. So that counts, right? But I also don't think about kind of the democratic implications of these things as having to be narrowly tied to conventional forms of political participation that way, right? And so anything, the people, for example, like Candida, who are deciding of their own volition that now they're going to spend time in the local civil court just helping people to find their way to navigate that court. That is democratic citizenship, right? That is I'm a member of this community. and I'm going to go to this institution, this court, that is a political institution, and I'm going to try to change the way that people are experiencing it and the way that it's structured. So there's a whole range in terms of how I think about democratic participation. And in interviews, when I ask people about this, I try not to signal for them that I'm talking about anything in particular. I don't say, tell me about voting. I just try to listen and probe for all of the different ways that they might be engaging locally in their community, on a state level, whether it's, someone said, oh, our state was passing a bill about civil legal representation, and I went to the Capitol, right? So that's clearly, it's like, well, that's political participation, but I want them to tell me about all of those things. Part of the interesting thing is, what are the different range of ways that people are responding to this politically, that it's shaping the role that they're playing as members of a democratic polity, right? And then the third question, or the first one rather, because I was working backwards.
That's okay. About why they don't blame the government.
Oh,
I suppose it's because they see each other.
Yeah, and that's what I want to learn more about, right? I mean, it's a little bit appalling to me that the elephant in the room as far as who's responsible, and it's not necessarily being attributed there. Especially when there's so much blaming the government going around. You know what I mean? It's not as though it's not in our nature as Americans to blame the government, right? So why in this realm we would not? It may be because there's some disconnect between like the political system more broadly and the courts in people's minds, right? Or they may not understand the nature, for example, of legal aid organizations, that they're largely publicly funded. So it could be some sort of informational gaps driving that, but I don't know quite yet.
Very briefly, I see the courts as symbols of injustice too, both the criminal and the civil courts. And I'm black and middle class, and I live in what's called a Euro chic neighborhood, just south of here. I'm a progressive socio-political commentary writer, and I'm also a progressive political activist. I used to live in the Urbana-Champaign community, University of Illinois flagship, and I went to observe the civil courts there, filled with mostly black people, 98%, 99% black people, white judges.
Which is not the population of the area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And white judge would treat I just have to use this word, white judge would treat these poor, black people like shit, and try to get them to agree to all sorts of things that it was well within their rights not to agree to. But literally would yell at these people when you call their cases.
Yeah.
Why won't you do this? It's like, I felt sad because their rights are protected in this. Why won't you do this?
Yeah. Yeah, the racial dynamics of those spaces are are palpable to the people that I'm interviewing. And interestingly, a handful of the folks that I've interviewed who are white, they talk about the racial dynamics in the court, right? They're sitting there waiting for their case to come up on the docket, and they're noticing, like, whoa, well, the courts are horrible, but I definitely wouldn't want to be a black person in that courtroom, but it also depends on the area because, in some places the judges are black, right? But they're still treating black folks that way. And so there's all sorts of stuff going on there,
I was curious to hear more about the operationalization of civil legal need and civil legal problem, because I'm thinking especially historically about the expansion of civil legal services in the 60s, really being motivated by people who wanted to empower low-income folks whose problems had been sort of treated as like social work problems, and people who were in need of therapy and rehabilitation, as opposed to people with legitimate grievances. So I'm curious about, sort of how you're operationalizing that, and if you're capturing anything else sort of before people reach these institutions where there might be some branching, where people are steered towards sort of conceiving of their problems as civil legal needs versus like I need a social worker.
Yeah, that's right. The easiest way to, and so we're doing this in a couple different ways. The easiest way is to look at, for example, the way that actual legal services providers think about what legal needs are, right? So the Legal Services Corporation says, here is, and they have an exhaustive list of things that here's what counts as legal needs, and it's pretty expansive, and it's grown over time, actually. That's one of the things we've been tracking, because even kind of prominent organizations like the Legal Services Organization, our institutions like that, change over time what gets counted on their list of civil legal needs. And so part of what we want to understand is like, are there economic, social, or political factors that are driving what we're understanding to count as legal need, right? And how is that kind of, it's sort of endogenous to the question that we're asking in a way that means that we have to think about it. And so there's that exhaustive list, right? And then there's the question of like, you know, what people understand their civil legal needs to be and whether or not it aligns with that list, right? And sometimes there is a kind of disjuncture there. And so we're allowing people to tell us what when they encounter a problem that they understand to be a legal problem, right? And why they understood that to be a legal problem, right? So in interviews, some people, they understand it to be a legal problem because they get a summons, you know? But other times, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be understood to be a legal problem, right? A lot of, for example, sort of domestic violence issues are like this. So you don't necessarily know that you can go to court and get an order of protection. And a lot of people are giving you other advice. And they're saying, well, you just need to get away from him. You just need to move out of the house. You just need to. And so, but is there someone there who's like, you know, you can get this legal thing called an order of protection, or even like non-eviction related housing issues, right? Like, so your roof is leaking, like, profusely. You know you can do something about this. You can actually take your landlord to court. Many people just don't even think about that. That's my roof is leaking. Like, where can I go to try to get this fixed, right? So one of the reasons why we're recruiting people, not just at organizations that specifically offer civil legal services, but at community organizations that just are there to generally help people, right? So like the local urban league, or even the YMCA. These are places where people go to get all different kinds of help, right? And at that moment where they go to that organization for help, they can often either be directed one way or the other. And what we're finding is like there's some variation in where they're going to be directed. And so we were talking to some folks from the Urban League in Florida, in Miami, Florida. And one of the executive directors there said, well, we don't tell people to think about it as legal. We don't send them to legal aid offices because they're going to go and get turned away because those offices are overwhelmed. And so we just try to help them brainstorm how to deal with these problems in other ways. And then there are other places where the local community organizations are funneling people into. So that really matters, like what role are organizations playing in shaping people's understanding of the problem itself on the front end as a legal problem or not. Or you might acknowledge it as a legal problem, but just not suggest pursuing it in a way that is utilizing the law, right? So those are kind of like first order questions that we're also trying to think through as well. And that's why the first slide, when I said that we're talking to policy advocates and organizations, like community organizations and a wide variety of them, some of what we're trying to understand from those folks is like the larger process of how things get constructed as legal problems and who gets directed to deal with their problems as legal problems per se versus as some other kind of problem, right? So that's great. That's hard. I mean, the challenge for us with this project is it almost feels like a bottomless, like infinite regress. Like, okay, now what counts as legal? Okay, now, but it also feels like if you don't get any of those, if you're not attentive to any of those kind of core issues, then when you try to get to the questions down the line, like, what are the democratic repercussions? Well, can't really get to that if you haven't dealt with these precursor questions, which is, but we also, it's not going to take, we don't want to work on this for 10 years, so there's a trade-off there. But these set of questions we've decided we can't let go. We can't trade off, right? So I don't know how much time we have. I'll go forever, but
mine is kind of really aligned with the previous question, which is that so there are ways in which the community organizations are structuring who actually seeks legal representation and who doesn't.
Yeah.
But I was also curious if they're across domains or just kind of in terms of race or class groups, if you see kind of across all the domains any systematic differences in who just never thinks to do it and who automatically assumes that their problems have a solution or that somebody
Yeah.
should help them.
That's really interesting. I don't think I can know that yet, in part because we have almost, not everyone, but I would say like the vast majority of people, with the exception of like 4 people, everyone else that I've interviewed thus far is either Black or Latino. So I don't have, and most everyone is very poor. So I don't have much variation just yet along the lines of race and class, and we will. It's just a function of like how the way that we started with respect to recruitment and doing the interviews. And so as we pan out and we interview all of the different kinds of people that we want to interview, this is precisely why, I mean, the kind of research I do and the way that my focus tends to be, I'm like, I'm perfectly content to just interview all poor people of color. And just learning about their experiences is more than enough for me. And one of the things my co-author said is like, but what if we can understand their experiences better by having a sort of set of other folks who have a different set of experiences, who may like be more inclined, for example, to understand their problems as legal problems because, well, I'm not, there's a way in which you may think that low-income people, in part because of like our larger culture around the way that we think about poverty and we can sort of individualize structural problems, are going to understand their problems in really individualized ways and maybe not think about pursuing or thinking of their problems as legal problems, right, that are connected to broader structural issues. Whereas maybe that's not what we would see with middle-class white folks who are like, well, generally I'm not the problem. So there must be another way of solving this that involves some other route besides me taking it on myself. So that's exactly the kind of variation that we're wanting to sort of sort out, So we will do those interviews. But because I haven't yet, it's really hard for me to think about what the race-class variation is going to be. But hopefully there is some variation there because I think it will be instructive.
I was wondering if you thought about interviewing judges and if you thought about interviewing sleazy landlords.
So judges I haven't thought about interviewing, actually, I'll be honest. That the thought just hasn't crossed my mind. It's worth thinking about. The landlords, yes, right? So, and recently I was talking to someone about this and they said, well, there are 2 sides to some of these disputes, right? It's not just the tenant who, just by virtue of like my research preoccupations, I'm more inclined towards thinking about the perspective of, but then there's also the landlord, like there's the other side of it, and you'll learn something about the system by pursuing that other side. It's something that we have to think through. We already have a long list of different kinds of people who we're talking to, and we already have a sense that the project is unwieldy, that there are really 2 or 3 books here, and we're just going to have to find one and write it, and then other people can write other books, or we can write a different one down the line, or what have you. So there's a part of me that's wary about sort of any more like adding extra categories of people to talk to. But I guess at base the question for me would be like the relationship between my core interest and interviewing that set of folks. Like, so what can I learn about the kind of like the way that democratic citizenship is structured by these courts by talking to landlords? So it may be that the answer is a lot. But I think until in my mind I have sort of thought through the kind of theoretical connection to that group of people, I would be hesitant to sort of add an extra group, But I have to think through it. I haven't thought through it as thoroughly as I could. All right.
I think we are out of time.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Can we give her a round of applause?
This was really fun. Thank you for your questions.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that.
One thing to think about is the courts might not differ as much across your geographic regions as the laws differ across your geographic regions. And the laws aren't going to, so you have 2 different domains here. You have